She was the face of modern elegance, sharp cheekbones, aristocratic poise, and a quiet intensity that made Stella Tennant stand out from every other model on the runway. In the 90s, when supermodels ruled the world with loud glamour, Stella did it differently. She didn't chase fame. Fame came to her. She was the rebellious beauty who walked for Chanel, Alexander McQueen, and Versace, redefining fashion with her androgynous charm and timeless look. But behind the striking images and magazine covers, there was a deeper story, a quiet struggle few ever saw. Born into British nobility, Stella Tennant wasn't your typical model. She didn't seek the spotlight, and yet she became a muse to the world's greatest designers. Her career soared, and from the outside, it looked like a dream: wealth, family, legacy, and love. But as the cameras flashed and runways lit up, Stella began to drift from the world that once embraced her. Something in her spirit shifted. She walked away from the fashion industry more than once, choosing privacy and family over fame. And for a time, it seemed like she found peace. But even those who shine the brightest can carry unseen shadows. In December 2020, just days after her 50th birthday, the world was stunned by news of Stella Tennant's sudden death. Tributes poured in from fashion icons, fellow models, and grieving fans. But beneath the public grief was a silent question: what really happened to Stella Tennant? This is the story of a woman who gave everything to her art, who touched lives without seeking attention, only to vanish in silence. As we uncover the layers of her life, her legacy, and the quiet pain she carried, one thing becomes clear. Not all supermodels fade from the spotlight. Some simply walk away and never return. Stella Tennant didn't just step into the fashion world, she shook it up. When she first appeared in the early 90s, the industry was obsessed with glamour and sex appeal. But Stella was different. Tall, lean, with short dark hair and piercing eyes, she didn't fit the mold, and that's exactly why she became unforgettable. Karl Lagerfeld called her his muse. She became the face of Chanel almost overnight. There was something magnetic about her presence, cool, confident, almost untouchable. She carried herself like someone who didn't need the world's approval, and yet the world couldn't look away. But Stella wasn't chasing a dream. Modeling wasn't even her plan. She had studied sculpture and came from a family rooted in tradition and aristocracy. Her grandmother was a duchess, and her upbringing was steeped in British heritage. When she agreed to pose for a shoot as a favor to a friend, it was meant to be a one-time thing. Instead, it sparked a whirlwind career that pulled her into the center of fashion's biggest stages. Despite the fame, she kept her distance from celebrity culture. She never seemed fully at ease in the spotlight. She preferred the quiet of the countryside, raising her children, gardening, and riding horses on the family estate in Scotland. She spoke openly about how the fashion industry had changed over the years, and how she struggled with the pressure to maintain a certain image. Friends and insiders say she had a strong sense of self, honest, grounded, even shy at times. But they also say she carried a weight that was hard to name. As her career slowed and her priorities shifted, Stella withdrew even more from public life. By 2020, she had nearly vanished from the public eye, living privately with her family, far from the flash of cameras and fashion shows. Then, just days after celebrating a milestone birthday, the news broke. It didn't make sense. There were no warning signs, no scandals, no clear reasons. People who knew her were left with questions. How could someone so strong, so full of life, be gone so suddenly? What was she really going through in those final months? The world had seen the supermodel, but had they missed the woman behind the image? The answers remain unclear. But the silence surrounding her final chapter speaks louder than any headline ever could. In the fashion world, there's a cost to beauty that people rarely talk about. Behind every perfect runway walk, every glossy cover photo, there's often a quiet pressure, one that never really fades, even when the cameras do. For Stella Tennant, that pressure was something she managed with grace for years, but those close to her say it left invisible marks. She wasn't someone who sought out fame, but fame found her anyway. And with it came the expectations, to stay thin, to stay relevant, to stay perfect. Even when she stepped back from modeling, that weight didn't fully lift. Friends say she had moments of light and joy, especially with her 4 children, and during quiet times on her farm in the Scottish borders. But they also mention stretches where Stella seemed distant, even distracted. Her separation from her husband, photographer David Lossnet, after over 2 decades together, added another layer of change to her already shifting world. It was said to be amicable, but after a life built on shared memories, even peaceful partings can leave behind echoes. As the world around her moved faster, with social media taking over fashion and younger models constantly rising, Stella remained private, almost hidden. She didn't post online. She didn't make appearances. And for many, she became a ghost of the fashion era she helped define. But for those who knew her, her quiet presence was still strong until it wasn't. The silence after her death felt deafening. Tributes poured in. Naomi Campbell, Stella McCartney, Edward and Infel all spoke of her kindness, her strength, her unique spirit. But no one had real answers. The official reports were respectful, vague, and left room for more questions than clarity. What had Stella been feeling in those final weeks? Had the weight of her past caught up with her? Or was it something deeper, something even those closest to her never fully saw? The mystery of her final days isn't just about what happened, it's about what was left unsaid. There were no dramatic headlines, no farewell notes, just a quiet ending to a life that had once stood at the center of the world's gaze. And as more time passed, one thing became clear: sometimes, even the brightest stars flicker in silence before they disappear. In the months before her death, Stella Tennant seemed to disappear even further into herself. She had always been reserved, always drawn to solitude, but now there was a heaviness to her quietness that her friends couldn't ignore. Some noticed she was harder to reach, slower to respond, and when she did speak, her voice carried a certain distance, as if she were somewhere else entirely. The fashion world, busy as ever, barely noticed her absence. But those who loved her felt something was shifting, something they couldn't quite name. She had always been strong, deeply private, and never one to ask for help. That's what made it so hard to tell when something was wrong. On the surface, her life looked calm. She had her children, her garden, her art. She spoke now and then about creative projects, ideas she wanted to explore. But behind that, there were signs, small but real. A certain tiredness in her eyes. A kind of detachment that felt out of character. Those closest to her began to worry, but even then, no one imagined what was coming. It's easy to romanticize the lives of supermodels, to think they live untouched by the struggles of everyday life. But Stella was no different. She dealt with pressures, unseen and unspoken, that built up over time. The fashion world is fast, demanding, and often unforgiving. And even someone as iconic as Stella could feel lost inside it. She had already made the decision to step back, but sometimes, stepping away isn't enough to escape the weight of the past. The days before her passing were, by most accounts, quiet and uneventful. She had just celebrated her 50th birthday. Her children were home. It was the holidays. Everything should have felt peaceful. But something wasn't right. And in that silence, something happened, something no one saw coming. The suddenness of it, the lack of any warning, left a hole that couldn't be filled. The fashion industry stood still. Headlines whispered the truth gently, trying to respect her memory. But beneath the public mourning was a deeper question, one that still lingers: how could someone so admired, so full of grace, be hiding such a quiet pain? The answers are locked in those final days. And what came next would shake everyone who thought they knew her. Just when people thought they had come to terms with Stella Tennant's passing, a quiet wave of unease began to ripple through those who had been close to her. In the weeks after the headlines faded, a few close friends began speaking more openly, not to the press, but among themselves. They started comparing notes, piecing together conversations, memories, and private moments that hadn't made sense at the time but now felt loaded with meaning. And slowly, a picture began to form. Not of someone who had simply slipped away, but of someone who may have been silently crying out for help in ways no one fully understood. One friend recalled a phone call, just a month before her death, where Stella had talked about feeling lost, like she no longer had a place in the world she once belonged to. Another remembered a letter, handwritten and never sent, tucked in a drawer after they had helped clean out her studio. It wasn't dramatic or alarming, but it hinted at something deeper, words about time slipping by, about a life lived too fast, and a quiet longing to disappear from it all. The letter wasn't dated. It could have been written years ago. Or weeks. Then came something even more unexpected. A photographer she had worked with during her early days shared a story from a recent project Stella had quietly begun before her death. It wasn't fashion. It was a personal art series, photos of empty landscapes, abandoned places, shadows and light. She called it Stillness. The work had been kept private, hidden even from those closest to her. And in every frame, there was a certain feeling, loneliness, reflection, isolation. The images were haunting, and now, they felt almost like a farewell. But it didn't stop there. Her family, still grieving and trying to understand what had happened, discovered an unfinished journal she'd kept over the years. Most of it was filled with sketches and ideas. But in the final pages, there were quiet reflections, short entries that hinted at internal battles, a growing disconnect from the world around her. Stella never used dramatic language. Even in her private thoughts, she remained composed. But the sadness between the lines was undeniable. What made this even harder was that she never let it show, not in public, not even in close company. She had mastered the art of keeping it all inside. And that realization, more than anything, was the second blow. Not just that she was gone, but that no one had truly seen the full depth of her pain until it was too late. As the fashion industry moved forward, Stella's absence began to feel heavier. She wasn't just another model. She had been a symbol of quiet strength, of redefining beauty on her own terms. And yet, her final chapter was written in silence, through hidden photographs, unsent letters, and words she never said out loud. Whatever happened in those final days, it was becoming clear, this wasn't just a personal loss. It was a wake-up call, one that no one in her world could ignore anymore. In the weeks that followed, the scattered pieces of Stella Tennant's final chapter began to take shape. Her family, still wrapped in grief, made the difficult decision to share what they had learned, not with the tabloids, but in a quiet statement meant to honor her truth. Stella had been struggling with long-term mental health challenges. It was something she had kept private, even from those closest to her, out of a desire to protect her loved ones, and maybe out of a belief that silence was strength. She had carried the weight of expectation for so long, always appearing composed, elegant, in control. But beneath that surface, she had been quietly fighting to hold herself together. Her loved ones hoped that by sharing this truth, it would help others who were silently struggling too. The fashion world responded with an outpouring of support, not just in mourning, but in reflection. For decades, the industry had idolized perfection while ignoring the personal cost. Stella's passing forced a painful but necessary conversation about mental health, pressure, and how often the strongest people are the ones we overlook. It felt like the story had found its ending. Stella's pain was finally seen. Her life, though cut short, was remembered not only for its beauty but for its bravery. But just when the grief began to settle, one more unexpected detail came to light, a final twist that no one saw coming. Months after her death, her daughter discovered a locked drawer in Stella's art studio. Inside was a small box filled with old film rolls, sketches, and a short video she had recorded alone. In it, Stella spoke softly to the camera, not about modeling or fame, but about purpose. She talked about losing herself, trying to find meaning outside of beauty and image, and how the stillness she longed for wasn't about disappearing, it was about peace. She hadn't meant to be remembered for her final act. She wanted her art to speak, her story to help someone else, maybe even save someone else. And in that quiet message, left behind not for the world, but for those she loved most, Stella gave something rare, an unfiltered truth, not polished for the public, but real. A final moment of clarity, after a lifetime spent behind the lens. After that final recording was discovered, something shifted in how people remembered Stella Tennant. She was no longer just the supermodel who graced the runways of Paris and Milan, or the face of Chanel who captivated the world with her elegance. She became something deeper, someone who lived a life filled with quiet complexity, strength, and deep emotion. Her family chose to share parts of her final video, not for attention, but to honor the side of her that few ever saw, the artist, the mother, the woman who had spent a lifetime balancing grace with gravity. In the months that followed, exhibitions were held featuring her final art series, Stillness, alongside pieces from her early career. But it wasn't the fashion photos that drew people in, it was the raw, quiet power of her private work. Fans, friends, and strangers came to see a different Stella, one who had channeled her pain into beauty. Her story began to inspire others to speak out, to open up about their own struggles, especially within industries where image often overshadows emotion. Fashion magazines paid tribute not just with glossy spreads but with honest conversations about mental health, the toll of fame, and how the industry needed to do better. Younger models started sharing their own stories, no longer feeling like they had to suffer in silence. In a way, Stella's legacy became a bridge between beauty and truth, silence and voice. For her children, it was a painful journey, but one filled with pride. They saw the world finally embracing their mother not just as a style icon, but as a whole person. Someone who loved deeply, felt deeply, and left behind more than photos. She left a message. That it's okay to not always be okay. That asking for help isn't weakness. And that even in silence, there can be strength. Stella Tennant's life was full of contrasts, fame and privacy, elegance and rebellion, strength and struggle. And while her story ended too soon, it didn't fade. It opened a door. One that invites honesty, compassion, and the reminder that behind every perfect image is a real person, with a story worth hearing. And in remembering Stella, we remember that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in truth.